Welcome to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast.
Welcome back to A Fork in Time, the Alter History Podcast. Don sitting in I'm going to call it the host chair today. I don't think I'm going to be driving much before it's all said and done. But I'm happy to be joined today by Mr. Robert Koshu. Robert, how are you this evening?
Good. Glad to be back after a little bit of travel for work.
You've been traveling for work. We've had a little bit of a hiatus in recording, so everybody's sort of getting back in the groove here. I'm also joined by Eric, who has a different name on his screen. I'll let him decide if he wants to explain that, but that would be the newly married Eric Darlingbond. So, Eric, how are you
Hello,
doing?
Don. I'm doing great. I'm doing just darling. If I
Doing
say so
just
myself.
darling, if he just says so himself. And our topic tonight, and I'm going to let Eric sort of introduce us here, is sort of relevant to his last name, now hyphenated last name. And he'll explain why that is. He also is the one that suggested we've had this one kicking around for a while. And just so we're clear here, we're not going hard history tonight. This is one of our little, our fun little jaunts into the what I sort of call the whimsical side of what we do here, but still fun. So, Eric, where are we going metaphorically and I guess and conversationally tonight?
Well, Don, Robert, ever since I was born, I had the last name Bond, and so naturally every topic of conversation that has come up since forever is whenever I introduce myself, somebody says, "Oh, like James Bond." And it's like, yes, like James Bond. Are you related to him? And then you have to have the awkward conversation. No, James Bond isn't actually a real person. Or sometimes if I'm in a pretty pesty mood, I might say, "Oh yeah, but I don't like to talk about him. He abandoned us. He abandoned all of the Bond group."
I think I would regularly go with the latter option there, given the choice, Eric, just
Yeah.
for the fun of it. Seeing how long you could sustain that with whoever you're talking to until you got bored of it, obviously, because.
So the real question is, did you ever introduce yourself as Bond? Eric Bond.
Oh, multiple times.
Okay.
Mostly when I was laying it on really thick with somebody and I needed something from them of like, "Oh, teacher, please, I'm sorry. I didn't do this homework because I know the material and I just didn't feel like it. But, my name's Bond, Eric Bond, and how are you? What's your life like? Tell me more about yourself." Total teacher's pet.
No, I get it. I would have played that card too. So the thing that jumped into my head as we were talking about doing this, and even in some of our discussion here off podcast before we got started, is when I think everybody, when they hear Bond, has an image that pops into their head. It's going to be one of the actors that's played Bond. I'm sure we'll talk about this when we go through. So I'm going to go around the screen. I'm going to start with Robert and then go to you, Eric. Robert, when I say Bond, what's the first image that pops into your head? I have a pretty good idea, but I'm going to ask.
My name is Moore, but he is not my favorite Bond.
Okay. So Roger Moore, who portrayed from, I don't know if we have this up on the screen that we're all sort of looking at here. Moore took over the role in the 70s, mid 70s,
early mid
70s.
Yeah, early to mid 70s.
So Moore would be your mental image or your name. Your
mental image more than name, because name just kind of hits to my favorite Bond.
Okay. So when somebody says James Bond, you see Roger Moore in your head at some point immediately.
Yep.
Because again, I think everybody who's familiar at all with this British movie franchise, we were talking a little bit about that, Eric, and I'd like to circle back around to that. But everybody who's familiar with it, I think, has that iconic Bond. So, Eric, who is Bond for you?
Daniel Craig right now. It used to be Pierce Brosnan.
Okay. Do you think that that's a generational thing, given what we're talking about here? It's probably whoever was playing Bond when you were at some point when you were first becoming aware of the franchise and going to the movie theater?
I think it was more the fact that my grandparents who looked after us played a lot of 80s television. So my two dads and Family Ties were regular go-tos for me. And part of that was Remington Steele, but only season 1 of Remington Steele before they got rid of the interesting side characters. So that was always my primer.
Okay. So for you, Eric, it's going to be Brosnan. For Robert, it's going to be Roger Moore. For me, I probably think that it's also Moore if you pressed me on that, but it's not as fixed as it used to be. But it would have been between Connery and Moore. But I am more of that generation like Robert is, where Moore was the Bond du jour, so to speak, at the time. And so he was the Bond that I first saw in a Bond movie that I saw at the theater. They used to appear pretty regularly. ABC, I think, had the rights to run one on Sunday night movies like 2 times a year. And so you inevitably would have, a Bond flick. And those, of course, were mostly the Connery flicks at that particular time. So the notable actors who have played Bond for a period of time that we think of them as being Bonds are, we've already named 3 of them, right?
Yeah.
Connery, four.
Yeah.
Connery, Moore, Pierce Brosnan, and Daniel Craig.
Yeah.
But these are not the only folks who have ever played Bond, right?
No.
Well, you do have one-off in there because you have Lazenby, who on Her Majesty's Secret Service, and did you say Dalton?
No.
Timothy Dalton covered it twice in The Living Daylights and License to Kill.
Yeah. It's also, I know it's a little known like Bond trivia fact that there is another Bond. Woody Allen played James Bond in like a comic turn on the character whenever that was. So bar trivia there at some point, if somebody asks you name all the Bonds, you probably, depending upon how loose the rules are being applied there, you probably have to name Woody Allen.
You have one more too that we'll talk about later. The first Casino Royale, David Niven.
Mm-hmm.
Filmed kind of as a comedy parody James Bond.
Yeah. So, iconic role. The actors who have portrayed Bond are well known. But the list is long and distinguished, which is why this becomes an alternate history podcast. By the way, the list is long and distinguished of actors who were pursued and turned down the role, and I know in some rare instances actually wanted to play the role and never got the chance. But most of the time, these would have been actors that were pursued, considered, but for some reason, in some cases, for example, contractual, where they weren't allowed to for whatever the case might be. But they were not either at that time. One example comes to mind: Brosnan meets this thing of he couldn't when first offered, but later did, or have never portrayed. And so that's what we're going to explore today on here on A Fork in Time. Or we're going to look at what would have happened if some of these alternate Bonds had come into reality and what that might have meant. And I can already think, for me, in many cases, it's going to mean very different career trajectories. Probably not for the ones who obviously would have played Bond, who didn't, that would have changed their career, but probably more impact on the ones who would not have played Bond that then would have gone on to do things other than Bond. I think that's probably the more interesting twist there. So, Eric, this was your topic. So you get to propose our first alternate Bond to talk about, and we can discuss that a little bit. Who meets the nomination?
My first nomination is none other than Cary Grant. He was offered the role of James Bond. He turned it down because he felt he was too old. He was age 56 in 1962. He was kind of the nadir of his popularity. Like he was still regularly getting work, but it wasn't the 40s and the screwball comedies that made him famous. He was also developing an LSD fascination. And he turned it down, much like he turned down Roman Holiday, because he felt he was too old to be Audrey Hepburn's love interest. Then he's in Charades, where he's Audrey Hepburn's love interest much later on.
So obviously we know who Cary Grant is, or most of us know who Cary Grant is. I guess we may have some younger listeners who may be like, "Ooh, what?" But what do you think is the major? So he would have been Bond instead of Connery.
Yep, Connery, correct.
So this is one of the places, because we'll end up doing this multiple times, where it's the same actor who would have gotten nudged out by the alternate Bond here. So before we talk about what that would have meant for Grant's career, why don't we just go ahead and get the what if Connery had never been Bond, regardless of whoever displaces him, probably at whatever point. How different would Sean Connery's career have been if he had not been Bond?
Well, Zardoz probably wouldn't exist.
Okay. Was he? I guess I struggle with this because I think of him iconically as Bond. What had he done before Bond that we would all recognize and know, I guess?
I couldn't tell you.
Yeah, the first thing I wanted to say was Lion in Winter, but that was afterwards. Let's see. His roles include Hell Drivers, in which he made basically a supporting appearance, Darby O'Gill and the Little People, a Disney studio film, which is where Albert Broccoli, who was kind of the infamous producer who pushed it, discovered him. And then the other big film he did was The Longest Day.
So he was in a war flick in the 50s.
Yep.
And I'm looking here now. Thank you, Wikipedia, for coming to our rescue. I know that he and Michael Caine did a number of things. So they did some theater. He did some stage work as well in the 50s. But pretty much at the time he assumes the role of Bond, safe to say recognizable face, but not an overly recognizable face. He hadn't, he wasn't a star from something else stepping into the role by any stretch of the imagination. Is that a fair thing to say?
That's a fair thing to say. And this was kind of seen as first a one-off thing. James Bond had been a popular series of books by Ian Fleming. Reading the books is pretty intolerable. I tried reading one. It was kind of like reading American Psycho, where in that book, it's a lengthy list of brands, and that's supposed to show you that Bateman is insipid and insane, but it's played completely straight as like, oh, look at James Bond. He's living such an elegant life. He's taking in all of this luxury.
Yeah.
Because, war rationing, I suppose, made you very starved for any kind of glamour.
So is it a fair thing also to say that we don't know what Connery's, that's the what if, that's what we could explore here, but based on what we had seen before, that being James Bond for the continuing consistent payday that what it meant to be Bond, which it certainly became for Connery over time, but that it also opened up his awareness. So he got offered probably other roles that he probably would have never had the exposure or had never been seen for. Is that a fair thing probably to say as well?
I think that's a fair thing. He probably would have been more like an Oliver Reed if he found some level of success. He's this like very swarthy, good-looking guy with a bad dating history that nobody wants to talk about comfortably. And we would see him go like, oh yeah, it's that dude from Oliver. It's Sean Connery. Sean Connery takes Oliver Reed's career, is what I would suggest.
So he would be that. What else has that guy been in? Kind of guy in a lot of instances.
He'd be known for The Longest Day.
Okay. So we're all readily agreed there that in terms of his long-term career arc, Bond was a big plus for Connery's career. Like that's any great mystery or any great surprise.
Yeah, I don't think he could have been a Hollywood star without Bond.
Okay. So with Bond, obviously he gets a lot of other roles. Ultimately, getting an Academy Award winning turn and Best Supporting Role in The Untouchables. Getting to play Harrison Ford's father. He was old enough to pull that off, by the way.
In the best Indiana Jones movie, of course.
Oh, without a doubt.
Yeah. But did other things as well, including some things that he probably regrets doing. I don't think anybody will ever say that the best performance he ever delivered was in Highlander, but it led to things like that, obviously, as well. But later on in life, became more of a still a I think he was still named People's Sexiest Man Alive, in his 70s or something like that, maybe about the time of Entrapment or some one of the movies maybe in that ilk right there. So. Yeah. Major plus for his career arc. We all agree that, right?
Well, and I'm going to throw out that because of him, there is a non-canon canon Bond.
Okay, which is when he reprised the role.
Nope.
No?
Another one.
Tell the story, Robert.
The Nicolas Cage movie where Nicolas Cage, and I am, oh my gosh, my brain just went. Jerry Bruckheimer, Nicolas Cage.
Is it the island? The Rock.
Oh, The Rock.
The Rock. Thank you. The Rock.
Yeah.
There is an entire theory out there that the character Mason that Sean Connery played in The Rock is actually James Bond, and it fits. One of my, when you're trying to go to sleep and you're not really wanting to do anything, so you watch dumb YouTube videos. There's an entire theory about that John Mason is actually James Bond.
So here's British Special Forces.
Yep.
All the stuff that's there. Okay. So by the way, no truth to the rumor that Nick Cage is actually Elvis, somehow reincarnated around, although I think Nick would like that to be the case as things might be. So again, the real timeline, which we've talked about more there, probably needed to, is that Bond impacts Connery's career, obviously, in a positive trajectory way that gives him a lot of opportunities and leads him to a lot of other roles. But he's not the guy we're talking about here. He's the guy that would have missed out. The guy that we've talked about here is Cary Grant. So what would have happened with Grant? Do you think Grant would have ended up in the serial nature of what Bond became, or would he have been one of these one-off, onesie-twosie Bonds, is the way that I think of him in my head?
Part of the reason Cary Grant gave as not wanting to do it was he didn't want to do a 3-film contract. They were pushing for that at the beginning. And it was all seen as too risky because no one's ever really adapted books as part of a film series. Like, this is the first cinematic universe, as we would see it today, is the James Bond. And for Cary Grant, his career is winding down at this point. But I think it would help to really revitalize him. He would definitely be able to get off the quintessential gentleman vibe. That I think that's what they were trying to elevate more than what the books were about.
Okay.
But I also love the Philadelphia story, so that might be my own personal crutch, being like, oh, I love that. He would be a great James Bond.
So the question is, though, if Grant signs, because Grant didn't die that much longer after 58, 56, when he was considered, would James Bond, the franchise, have existed for 50-something years? Or was Connery essential to that?
Cary Grant lived until November 29th of 1986.
Oh, he lived that long? I did not remember that.
Yeah, he kind of became a secluded hermit.
Although probably would not have been doing turns as Bond in what the movies evolved into in terms of stunts and the action sequences and all that into his late 70s or early 80s. Even though Connery did it to an older age, obviously, but not quite the same way.
Yeah. Connery had to be spry enough for the League of Extraordinary Gentlemen to play Alan Quatermain, which is his final and greatest role.
So, other than anyone we want to talk about on Cary Grant?
It's hard to say. Cary Grant is just such a figure. If you know him, that it's kind of hard to speculate. It'd be kind of like the Alfred Hitchcock movies, to where he's become this eponymous hero, which might have been the other thing that they were drawing on for.
Right.
Of like, well, he did North by Northwest, so maybe he could fit into this role. The other,
Go ahead.
Go ahead, Don.
No, I was just going to say I have never even struggled to read the novels. At least you took that effort, Eric. What I have consistently heard when I hear people talk about the movie role is that it is different. The bond of movies is not the bond of books in a lot of different ways, and some of that is physical things. Some of that is the especially like some of the Moore stuff almost gets to the point of being absurdly campy, although you can certainly, Bond villain exists in our lexicon now because of these sort of, off the wall, weird, eccentric people that were Elon Musk before Elon Musk was Elon Musk, kind of things. But
Elon Musk is Blofeld.
Well, yeah, exactly. And but the again, my understanding is that the bond of books and the bond of movies are very different, in the sense that there was some adaptation of what the role even meant in the movie franchise versus the books, I guess is where I'm going here.
Yeah, how Daniel Craig is portrayed in Casino Royale is the closest, because Bond is really just a hired gun who's well born. He is also, it's also incredibly racist, like pretty much every other paragraph. You will find insults for people you never could have considered. At one point, he insults the French of like, well, the French were never good with money. And it's like, is that a thing? Has that been a stereotype about the French? Ian Fleming?
Right. Well, and Fleming, of course, is connected to the espionage world because of the work that he did during World War II, as with some of the intelligence services work that was done there. I forget which streaming network it's on, but basically talks about the one of the deceptions that they played on the Nazis to convince them that regarding the D-Day landings.
Mincemeat.
Yeah, well, Ian Fleming was connected to that in the real world story that's there. So the reason I bring up the difference between the books and the movie characters is, if you've established Grant in the role, and so it's it doesn't have to match up with whatever is in the books. There's already been adaptation. So as an actor gets older, they can adapt things. They play on his strengths, they downplay his weaknesses. It's a character that's elastic and evolved enough over time to have some elasticity to it, I guess is my point.
Yeah, they had a body double for Roger Moore while running, so they can find somebody to do that for Cary Grant, I'm sure.
Yeah. So, Robert, your turn to nominate an alternate Bond.
Oh, let's throw one. I want to talk about one who became Bond, but was offered much earlier, because I think that I did not know that until I started researching. And I find just incredibly interesting that Timothy Dalton was actually offered the role in 1969, which would have been on Her Majesty's Secret Service time frame. So really the second or third, depending on how you're counting your Bond movies, time frame, and turned it down. But it was 69, Majesty's Secret Service. George Lazenby gets it. But Timothy Dalton,
who at that time, who was born in 46, so in 69 would have been
33?
33.
Yeah, 23. Oh, sorry. No. Yeah, 33.
33. But a very young looking 33. We're talking about this off podcast. This is about the time of The Lion in Winter when he plays.
Yeah. Philip the Second.
Yeah. As the very young, I guess the Dauphin at that point in the history. So, what's intriguing to you about Dalton in the role that young? Robert?
If Dalton gets it that early, do we ever get Roger Moore? And Connery had a little bit of gadgetry in his movies, but he was closer to the original Bond than Roger Moore ever was. I mean, Roger Moore just degenerated into pure comedy almost at one point doing Bond. But with Dalton, because when Dalton did come in for The Living Daylights, he really regrounded Bond again.
No, what I remember about those movies, because I remember critics at the time even talking about this, was it was this hard-edged, license to kill sort of, a ruthlessness to Bond that certainly hadn't been the Moore Bond by any stretch of the imagination, which was, the primary comparative point there, I guess, for a decade or more. But I guess your point, Robert, is this franchise may have taken a slightly different, more darker, more intense, more quote unquote realistic turn with a younger Dalton in the role.
With a younger Dalton, would it have stayed more in the realism realm that it didn't? I mean, when it got in, I mean, you're talking Moonraker. Just don't even get me started on the Moonraker, which was the first Bond movie I saw in the real world in theaters, but one of the most unrealistic Bond movies ever, and also one of the worst rated Bond movies ever. But do you get anything near that if you're with Timothy Dalton?
The real question is, would Timothy Dalton somehow make Live and Let Die even better than it already is? I mean, Live and Let Die is also a blaxploitation movie with James Bond as the lead, but
Well,
it's interesting how James Bond films kind of adapt themselves to whatever is in the zeitgeist to make themselves more relevant.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe it would have been kind of inevitable because, we're getting out of the 60s into the early 70s. We have this kind of more natural cynicism boiling up. That maybe that's why they went with Roger Moore to be more lighthearted, more escapist.
And that's an interesting thought, but
and of course he plays later, so you have this interesting thing of what the later version of Bond that he played. He would have played the script that was written for him at the time that he did it. So there's even that element going on there. Is it fair to take Dalton of the mid '80s back to Bond of the late '60s, early '70s, just because what was being written and what was being produced, what the films were versus what they became, and that whole thing going on with that?
Do you want to know what role Dalton did instead of James Bond in '69 to '70?
Okay.
He was Heathcliff in Wuthering Heights. They did a remake of Wuthering Heights, and he wanted to play Heathcliff.
Well, we were talking off podcast. I think the role that I most remember him in is playing. I can't remember the character's name now. Prince. He's the prince in the campy Flash Gordon of the.
That's where I was going to, Don, because that other than Bond, that's like the only thing I knew of Timothy Dalton.
Prince
was
Baron.
Yes, Prince Baron.
Yeah, he's also the villain in The Rocketeer.
I wouldn't have remembered that. I think I remember seeing The Rocketeer when Disney was trying to do something other than animation at one point in an earlier iteration.
See, that's how you know Disney is struggling. They're trying to make a live action movie. Like it happened with Walt Disney. It then happened again in the 70s with The Black Hole, and then it happened with The Rocketeer.
So there you go. This is how you can know your Disney epochs is by what live action thing are they trying now, kind of thing.
Let's see. I've gone back in time. Oh, the computer wore 10 issues. Okay, I know where I am. I can
orient. So, Robert, what else intrigues you about an earlier Dalton there?
Does he stay in it longer? Does he stay in it as long as Moore all the way through The Living Daylights, where he kept doing it? Because he basically got out at that point because he felt he was too old and people didn't like his portrayal. Or is he a once and done because the portrayal is something people don't like and they try to compare him to Connery? And does Connery come back at that point? because it's just one movie out.
And to me, the answer to that question, Robert, is sort of intrinsic to the whole idea of this serial role. We were talking about this off podcast. This one of the arguably the longest running serial movie franchise that exists, is that if you do something long enough, repetitively enough as an actor, this word comes along that begins with a T, ends with an typecast, that eventually you get labeled there. Eventually, the thing that catapults your career, gives you stability as an actor because of doing this on a recurring basis. You're going to be able to cash the movie checks every year or 2 years, particularly in the Bond franchise. But eventually, you're sort of, again, the reason that I brought this up this way, when I say Bond and an image pops into your head, is whoever that actor is, when you now see him in something else, the first thing you think is Bond. It works the other way too. So in your case, if Moore is your image of a Bond, Robert, when you see Roger Moore in anything else, the first thing you also think of is
James Bond. Well, and he played that to the hilt, because what did he play in the Cannonball Run? He played James Bond.
The only other movie that I could think of with Moore besides that, I'd forgotten that. I remember that now. But he played in a movie, I think that was called Falks or something like that, where he plays a British commando or something like that. I remember that they're like, terrorists have captured offshore drilling rig. I don't remember the plot of the movie well. But again, it's a Bond-esque character because he's playing off of that. And, to some degree, even we were talking about one of my favorite dramatic role that Connery ever played is, again, jumping here, but tying it together, was The Untouchables, which he won the Oscar for Best Supporting Actor. That is very close in time to him being in the third Indiana Jones movie, right, The Last Crusade. And you could argue there are elements of him playing Indiana Jones's father in that movie that were sort of Bond-esque.
Oh, definitely.
There's sort of chase sequences and action sequences that are played a little bit for comedy at his age, or along with Harrison Ford in the Indiana Jones genre. But you could argue that, there's an element of Connery in The Last Crusade that is Bondish, for lack of a better way of describing it, right? It's hard for him to get away from this role, is my point.
Well, especially because Indiana Jones is very much like, it's building off of old cliffhangers from the 30s and 40s, but it's also an inheritor of James Bond, because that's kind of the American equivalent, sort of like, who's our idea of an action hero franchise? It's James Bond. You know what? I think I have the better analogy. What's the name of Alec Baldwin's character in Hunt for Red October?
Jack Ryan.
Jack Ryan
is the American James Bond.
That's a very interesting analogy. And this is, I believe, I agree with you, Eric, but yet it's different at the same time, because it's not as much intentionally designed to be an action role. It ends up being an action role in a lot of the movie adaptations versus the books. But actually, his whole thing is he's sort of the intellectual.
He's an analyst. I'm an analyst, not a field guy.
Yeah, but who gets thrown in over his head in the field constantly? That's sort of the running thing that's there. So under your scenario, then your big questions, Robert, were: is the role different? Is the longevity of the role, and is the role different if Dalton's in that role at an earlier age versus evolving into the? And I agree with you, almost the parody that Moore became of the role as much as the reality. And Moonraker is the jumping of the shark, in my opinion, for the Bond franchise, if it hadn't done so before. In fact, we referenced an image from it on this very podcast, the episode that Eric Rush and Chris Coppola did, which is entitled "You Only Elon Twice." It was drawing that image from Moonraker, right? In terms of talking about the SpaceX kind of stuff. And again, see the references to the new owner of Twitter, Elon Musk, here as we're going through this. For me, mine actually is, what if Brosnan had assumed the role earlier?
Oh, okay. So if Brosnan had got it in the middle of his Remington Steele days.
Yeah. So I very much remember Remington Steele as an American TV franchise. I watched it when I I guess, an early teen, Queenish moving a little bit on there. Interesting premise. You could easily see why they thought he would adapt well into the Bond role because of him, assuming this role of Remington Steele, which is not who he was, but he steps into this fictitious thing that's been created by Stephanie Zimbalist's character. But it's almost like in my mind that Brosnan sort of treaded water for a number of years after Remington Steele until he finally landed in the role. And so then the question becomes, if he had done more Bond movies, he would have had more the length of the run. He had a decent run as Bond, obviously, but he would have had more the length of the run of a Connery or more. So we would think of him in that same, the Mount Rushmore of Bonds. I think he still makes the Mount Rushmore of Bonds, but he would have been a much more prominent position among the Bonds that we know today. And I don't think of his career being that much during that sort of what I call the treading water period. He came back and did some things later. I guess he did Mrs. Doubtfire, maybe in that time frame that I'm thinking about there, or approximately there. He did a thriller where he played like a Soviet mole spy in a nuclear thriller. I can't remember the name of it right now without pulling it up. But for me, the intriguing thing there is I think it would have been a bigger, broader career trajectory boost for Pierce Brosnan had he got a boost from it, no doubt, but it would have been a different path if had it started earlier. And very much like your Dalton theory there, Robert, if it started earlier, it runs longer. What difference does that make? And he's still young enough that he could have sustained that for a really while.
Yeah, I think he surpasses Roger Moore if he gets it earlier.
In terms of the number of films. Yeah.
Yeah. And in that case, it would have started with him doing The Living Daylights, which might be interesting to see if they would have kept that same darker tone for Bond, that more grounded vision for him in that.
The Living Daylights wasn't as dark as his License to Kill. That was by far the darkest Bond movie all the way through.
Yeah. And to me, where I come down on Brosnan, I think he would have been in the nice Goldilocks zone between what Moore became and what Connery was. He would have sort of been that middle of the roadish, sort of, you're going to get the same Bond every time you go. The women like him. The girls want to be with him. The guys want to be him, kind of thing when you're Pierce Brosnan, and that would have sustained for, potentially 2 decades easily without anybody being unhappy about altering it in some other way, shape, form, or fashion.
Yeah. And then we would never have to see him in Mamma Mia.
Well, that would be the absolute ultimate plus, Eric. That's my favorite thing about this alternate timeline is in fact, I think this is what the title of the episode is going to be. Something along the lines of, thankfully, Pierce Brosnan never sings or never sings on film.
Can't make fun of one of my wife's favorite movies. I'm sorry.
I will say, no, Robert, your wife has nothing to apologize for. Mamma Mia, pretty good movie. Much better than the stage show. Do you want to know why? I've seen the stage show 4 separate times because they keep doing it here in Arizona. And my friends get in it, and I love them, but I hate the show. Mostly. And I will say, the movie does the plot better. But, and this is the big thing, the main problem with the stage show is this. There's the scene where Sophie goes down to the dock to see adventurous possible dad, who's played by Skarsgård in the movie. And it's like, oh, okay, she's confronting him. Is he her father? Like, she has the family connection. And I think the writers of the show even said, like, yeah, canonically, he's the person who we think is the dad. But then they sing, What's the Name of the Game, with her trying to get him to open up. A very romantic song, but What's the Name of the Game is not an appropriate song for a father and daughter potentially to be singing to each other. And I've had to sit through that 4 times, including one time where my friends did a production of it and they did screensavers in the background to help establish the setting. For SOS, there was a screensaver of a crab on a beach, and the crab was in the O of an SOS drawn in the sand.
And just so we're clear, we've diverted, but these whimsical episodes normally do, Eric. You're not opposed to ABBA music. You're just opposed to ABBA music being forced into a musical the way that it's done in Mamma Mia, correct?
I'm just opposed to jukebox musicals not thinking about the implications of the songs they're choosing.
Okay.
I just want responsible jukeboxes. That's what I want for our country.
I didn't even think about my choice for my alternate Bond exposure here being that it eliminates Pierce Brosnan singing on film, but I'm sold. That's all that I need.
That is a plus. As much as my wife and I do enjoy the movie, I will agree. Him singing, if you notice in Mamma Mia 2, he does not sing.
I
never even saw Mamma Mia 2.
First of all, that Mamma Mia 2 even exists is a little bit of a little bit of a thing to be concerned about. But we've digressed here, but it's okay. Like I say, on these whimsical episodes, we often digress.
How about this? Don, may I suggest before we wrap up, who do you think would have been the worst Bond out of the research we've done? Who do you think would have been the absolute worst Bond? Or just bad for the franchise? You know my choice. It's Mel Gibson for reasons.
And this is before Gibson went off the absolute deep end with all the ways that he went off the deep end. But
before the divorce, before meeting a police officer, just he was kept from it because he was Australian.
Yeah, I can get on board with him being the worst there. Robert, do you have a worst from our listeners don't have the list in front of us that
David Niven.
Why?
He was first. He was actually in the first or the second choice for Bond, second movie. He ended up doing the parody. He was Fleming's personal choice.
So it's the personal betrayal that you despise.
Yeah. I think he would have. I think he gets a little typecast as a comedy actor, but I don't know if he could have carried. I don't know if he had the gravitas to carry Bond the way Connery did. Because I think if you don't get Connery in the first role, you don't get a James Bond franchise.
Yeah, I think that's probably true. There's a lot to be said for why it exists.
Yep.
It's hard
Connery is my favorite Bond, even though Daniel Craig is actually a very close second.
Yeah, I'm actually a fan of Craig as Bond and the recent turn there in the just the air of realism. I'm a big Judi Dench fan too, so her being M also helps carry those films a lot. Because they make that becomes a character of some substance and depth and some dimension to it. Man, going down the list here, it's hard for me to choose. There's going to be an honorable mention just because I have to get it out there, just because of the fun that it'll be. But looking through the list, we didn't mention this the first time through, and it's actually directly next to Eric's, which is Mel Gibson, is Christopher Lambert. And again, I've already made. Sadly, this is the second, maybe the third reference to this movie in this podcast episode. That's Highlander. Lambert, of course, played in the movie version of Highlander. I have to say that because later there was a TV series version, which is a whole other thing to even think about. But the Christopher Lambert, I just have a hard time. In fact, the note here on the Wikipedia page is the French accent prevented him from being chosen. They decided that playing a quintessential British Secret Service agent with a guy that sounds like he's from France, given the long-standing enmity between the two nations, would have been a little strange, first of all.
But you can play a French captain on a starship with the impeccable British accent.
Well, there you go. So apparently it works in one direction, but not the other. It's not a two-way street. So
listen, all we're saying is this. If Christopher Lambert had been cast as James Bond, it would have started Brexit in the 90s.
It's possibly so. And even the thing that probably saves Highlander from being just a campy, stupid movie into something that I'll watch over and over again, which is the Queen soundtrack for the movie. Even that doesn't probably save it. I can't imagine Lambert there. The other one that jumps out at me, we talked about this a little off podcast, is Sean Bean makes the list. And for those of you that don't immediately associate who Sean Bean is, he's one of those guys, you know who he is, but you may not remember that he's Sean Bean, is his name. But of course, probably best known for playing Ned Stark, for a lot of people now, playing Ned Stark in the first season of Game of Thrones, but also was played the antagonist in National Treasure, was Boromir in the Lord of the Rings trilogy from Jackson's films. Most recently on TV has been in the Snowpiercer TV thing. The irony about Sean Bean, the thing that's always referenced to him is how quickly his characters die. See Ned Stark season one. I guess there's no need to say spoiler alert now. Everybody knows that Ned dies in the first book and thus in the first season of Game of Thrones. But I have a hard time imagining. I can imagine being in the role, but I don't think they would have had a chance to play all these other fun things that I just described there if he had been Bond. So that's one of the ones I'm happy that was a miss. And as far as I know, Sean Bean never sang on film either. So
yes,
not something that we have to worry about there. Cool. I don't know if there was anything earth-shattering about this episode of A Fork in Time, but I sure love doing these. These are just fun to do because we so often, get down the history part. Eric, I wanted you to address something really quick. This interesting thing of British serial things. Do you have any? I know we talked about a little bit off podcast that the interesting thing here is Bond is a movie franchise. It's serial, but the leads keep changing. And then you mentioned another thing that is similar to that. Is there something quintessentially British that causes this to happen, or do we know?
I think it's because, unfortunately, with Doctor Who was the example of other people playing the Doctor. I think it's the fact that there's just a genetic bottle up among a certain amount of the population of England. It's a small island, and they just start to look the same. I mean, I love the British people, but look at their royals, Don. And you need to have diversity in your gene pool. I say this as a man who looks exactly like his father, his grandfather, and his great-grandfather. It is a curse, but...
Yeah, if you're not careful, eventually you'll end up with things like Habsburg chins. This is what you have to watch out for, is the point.
Habsburg chins and James Bond wives? I don't know where I'm going with that. Did I ever tell you the story of Roald Dahl working with Ian Fleming during World War II to influence American politics?
I don't think so.
Okay, so Noel Coward, Ian Fleming as the handler, and Roald Dahl were all part of a secret group with one purpose and one purpose only: to influence American editors, politicians, celebrities into supporting the Allies in World War II. Including Roald Dahl having a very active affair with an American news publisher's wife and sending a memo saying, "I'm so tired, I can't keep doing this," only to be told that he had to lie back and think of England because he was doing it for them. And then Roald Dahl wrote You Only Live Twice.
So he understood what it was like to be on His Majesty's Secret Service, is your point.
Exactly.
I think
I'm
that's
saying
as good.
Roald Dahl is the real James Bond. I guess.
I think we have to exit this episode if for no other reason than we could spin out of control beyond our ability for gravity to catch us back. But
yeah, it's starting to rain here in Arizona, so I might be just going a little daffy.
Well, that's also, I think, a sign of the apocalypse. So, Robert, Eric, thanks for joining me for the episode tonight. Just to tease our listeners a little bit and remind them of some important things. We do have a lot of things that we have planned, particularly queued up for after the first year. One of them is a series we've been talking about, which is focusing on the Roman period and some of the alternate things that would come out of history there. Probably once the semester's over, we'll be able to circle back around and pick up the paused, but still definitely want to get back around to it, Beau Breslin series of episodes there. Good responses for those. And I'm going to mention, because we're getting some traction there, we see a little bit more every time I mention it. We have a couple more people show up. We've started our Discord server, so it's a place to go and give us feedback and interact with the with the folks that are listeners to the show. I have a lot of fun there. Some of our most active participants there are people that are very clever and very good, and they know a lot of what they know a lot about. So if you enjoy some of the banter here, you ain't seen nothing yet till you go read some of the Discord stuff. So I encourage you to go to our Discord server. Of course, that's also a place you can, there as well as at the website, make topical suggestions and the other things that are there. About to announce something here. I was going to wait till his first episode, but I'll go ahead and do it here. Some of you have heard Dylan Holzheimer, who's been a guest on a number of episodes here of late. We've formally issued an invitation to Dylan to join the team, and he said yes. So I'm excited that we're going to be adding another member to the team. Dylan did an episode with me not too long ago on what if Elvis had lived, and he participated in some of the other stuff that's there. I think he brings some interesting, cool stuff to the podcast. The reason I mentioned that is that came from topical suggestions. Eric is here because he gave topical suggestions and then came to be on a show. We're still looking for people to join the team. We like the diversity of what goes on with that. And we also will be recording on sort of the companion podcast, The Room Where It Happened, some stuff here, getting caught back up on some of what's going on there. But again, we want to say thank you. As listeners, thank you for participating here. As I mentioned in the interview show that I did with Andrew a couple of weeks ago for his podcast, we do believe in this community thing. That's serious for us. And so come and join the community if you want to. Robert and I have known each other for a long time. Eric and I haven't, but it's works the same once we get here. We're all equal here on the podcast. And so that's really cool. All right. You guys have anything you want to say before we sign off?
Nope. I'm good.
All right.
Have a great night, everybody.
Okay. Thanks, guys. See you next time.
Thanks for listening to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast. Learn more and provide feedback by visiting our website at www.aforkintimepodcast.com. Connect to us on Facebook at facebook.com/aforkintime or follow us on Twitter at AFIT Podcast. If you want to support the show financially, visit our Patreon page at patreon.com/aforkintime. We hope you will join us next time.